War Stories, Part 8. The Quiet Rebellion. May, June 1917. During the First World War, trench soldiers on both sides faced a kind of warfare that no one before or since had to fight. Every day promised soldiers a gruesome death or injury from sniper fire and artillery bombardment. Once or twice a year, there would be a big push that intended to kill at least half the men they knew. And along with the danger, there was the barren panorama of no man's land and the unending hardship of the trenches, ice and snow, rain and mud, baking heat, whatever the weather, a trench was no place for men to be. Rats gnawed their dead companions. They were perpetually plagued with lice, and any sort of plumbing system for the daily influence of hundreds of thousands of lined roofs was clearly out of question. In this tortured landscape, with hideous stench of excrement and rotting corpses, the war went on and on and on, till those fighting believed it would go on forever. Oh, Jesus, make it stop, was the heartfelt plea ending British frontline officer Siegfried Sassoon's 1918 poem Attack. But not all soldiers were prepared to carry on fighting. The British and American armies avoided any major outbreaks of rebellion, but every other major fighting nation had its share. Naval mutinies in Germany occurred in 1917, and at the end of the war, some Austro-Hungarian troops fighting on the Eastern Front mutinied as early as 1915. Most critical of all, Russian soldiers deserted and mutinied in droves, and brought on the revolutions of 1917, which led to Russia's withdrawal from the war. French army mutinied too. In the spring and clearly summer of 1917, it was a decisive moment that could have cost France the war. Fortunately, the German generals didn't believe the reports received from spies and prisoners of war about the mutiny. By the time they realized it was really happening, the mutiny was over. The word mutiny conjures up images of drunken violence and descent into anarchy. It was a word made an officer's blood run cold. For without order and obedience, one man cannot tell other men to carry out actions that will undoubtedly result in death and injury. Mutiny renders an army ineffective more surely than a certain of machine gun fire or an artillery barrage. It can lead to utter defeat in a matter of days, so it usually punished with great severity in ancient Rome. Mutinous army legions that had returned to military discipline were subject to dissemination. One man in 10 was plucked from the ranks and executed. Who could have ever guessed that this ancient barbaric remedy would be employed again in the 20th century to restore order to one of Europe's greatest armies? The French mutinies of 1917 had their roots in German General Erich von Falkenhayn's decision to fight the war by taking French lives rather than French territory. In February 1916, he chose the French fortress of Verdun to do this. In a horrendous 10-month battle, the French and Germans fought for possession of this stronghold. Much of the fighting took place in dark concrete forts washed with blood, and steeped in the stank terror of men in hand-to-hand combat. When the battle ended in December that year, 350,000 French soldiers and 3,300,000 German soldiers had been killed or injured. There was nothing to show for all this slaughter. No territory had been won or lost. Each side had lost an almost equal number of troops. Falkenhayn was dismissed from his post, but he declared himself of bleeding the French army white. He declared the aim of bleeding the French army white had more of an effective than he realized. More of an effect. The French people were immensely proud of their army's success in defending Verdun, and the soldiers' first battle cry, "Is ne passeront pas," "They shall not pass," became a slogan of national self-esteem. The two generals held most responsible for fending off the Germans. Perhaps Philippi Etude and Robert Nivelle became national heroes. But after Verdun, many soldiers who had fought there felt they had nothing left to give. Not all soldiers had believed Nivelle's promise of an easy victory and decisive breakthrough. In fact, some of the companies of men had marched to the front line, bleating like sheep, believing they were lambs to the slaughter. It was a warning sign that was carelessly ignored. Chemin des Dames became the place where the morale of the French army finally broke. Nivelle's career was over. Already seriously ill with tuberculosis, he would not live to see the end of the war. His replacement was the hero of Verdun, Pétain. He moved from his post of chief of the French General Staff to become commander-in-chief of the French Northern and Northeast armies. Pétain had only been in his new job for 3 days when he received reports of mutiny among the frontline soldiers. The first occurred in the 2nd Battalion of the 18th Infantry Regiment. Out of 600 men, only 200 had survived the Chemin des Dames offense. After a brief respite behind the French front lines, they were once again ordered back to the trenches. It was the early evening of April 2019. 1917. Many of the men were drunk on cheap red wine that was supplied free, and frequently to French troops. Almost all refused to return, gathering in large groups and shouting, "Down with the war!" But by early next morning, the men had sobered up and marched back to the front line. As they marched, the officers of Babylon decided this insecurity should be immediately punished. At random, a dozen men were pulled from the ranks and charged with mutiny. 5 of the men were shot, another had an amazing escape. As he was being led to the firing squad by a group of guards, a German artillery bombardment fell around him. He ran into nearby woods and was never seen again. 4 days later, another mutiny broke out. This was far more serious as it involved the entire 2nd Division. Thousands of men, almost all drunk and refusing to carry their weapons or go back to the trenches. But when the drink wore off, most of the men gave in and marched to the front. A few who still refused to go were quickly arrested, and no one else in the division was singled out for punishment. It was just the beginning. In early May, this drunken rebellion spread throughout the army. It was an odd sort of mutiny, though. There was no reports of officers being attacked or killed, and no political demands when officers spoke to the men that had been elected by their comrades to represent them. They were told soldiers would continue to defend their trenches. It was the attacks against the Germans they were no longer prepared to take part in. While large-scale mutinies swept the ranks of the French army, extraordinary events were taking place in Russia, whereas similarly widespread mutiny had led to overthrow of the Tsarist government, deeply alarmed the other alliances. The French authorities were lucky there were no equivalents of Lenin or Trotsky among their troops. If there had been, the history of France and Europe over the course of the 20th century might have been very difficult. The French Rebellion century had no obvious leaders and was not being directed by anyone. But despite this, the mutiny spread so fast that by June, 54 divisions, over half the entire French army on the Western Front, were affected. Some 30,000 men just left their frontline posts and tried to walk home. The causes of mutiny were both simple and complicated. In essence, the ordinary French soldier had lost faith in his generals. He was not prepared to lay down his life for a way of fighting he no longer believed in. But there were other causes too, and these were serious enough to make anyone wonder why the mutiny had not happened before. Compared to their British counterparts, the French soldiers had to put up with harsher conditions and military discipline. Their pay was miserly. The food they had to eat was often cold, of very poor quality, and an especially troubling state of affairs for such a nation of gourmets. The British Army, by comparison, made great efforts to keep its trench soldiers supplied with hot food of reasonable quality. British soldiers from the other side of the canal also spent more time away from trenches and with their families than French soldiers. This was especially painful for the French, as many were fighting less than a day train journey away from their homes, but they were rarely offered to leave. Although all sides suffered horrendous casualties of the Allies, the French
lost the most men. 1 in 4 Frenchmen believe between the ages of 18 and 30 would die in war. 1.5 million in all, with millions more wounded and maimed for life. In the French High Command, the mutiny caused a sense of panic. French had already suffered so much, so many men had been sacrificed to keep the German army from overrunning their country. How awful it would be if the French lost the war because their troops had just given up and gone home. Pétain, as commander-in-chief of the mutinous divisions, was a man who had sorted it all out. Fortunately for France, he chose to address his soldiers' complaints rather than simply to suppress the revolt with great brutality. He had 3 major problems. First, he had to take immediate steps to introduce reforms to make life more bearable for these men, most of whom were conscripts fighting for the duration of the war, rather than career soldiers. Second, in order to uphold the discipline in the army, he had to punish those responsible, a difficult task when the mutiny really did seem to be spontaneous and lacking in ringleaders. Third, and most important of all, he had to keep the mutiny secret from the Germans. If they knew what was going on, they could break through the French lines and be in Paris within a week. Then the war would be lost for sure. Nonetheless, punishment for the mutiny was random and transparently unfair. For example, in June, a battalion of 700 men, under the command of General Emile Touflabe, was marching back to the front when they all disappeared into a forest at the side of the road. Either in the day, word had swept through the troops that there was a vast cave nearby in which they could all hide. Touflabe, showing commendable bravery, went into the cave and talked to the mutineers. He told them to return to the front by daybreak or they would all be slaughtered. The men came out, but once they were back under army command, 20 were pulled from the ranks and shot. Touflabe had neglected to mention this would happen, but the other divisions once order that had been restored. But the momentarily mutiny was swiftly forgotten and no one was punished. In all, perhaps 24,000 men were arrested and put before military courts. Of these, 554 judges to be leaders of the revolt were sentenced to death. Only 45 were shot. The rest were sent to the penal colony of French Guiana, a miserable fate for conscripted soldiers who had fought bravely until they could take no more. Those executed were shot before their comrades, who were then made to file past the dead men. Many more French soldiers were shot at random and without trial, but the number of those deaths is difficult to estimate. The mutiny was dealt with carefully, but beneath the concern there was an iron fist determined that such widespread disobedience would never be allowed to happen again. Among the rebellious divisions was a regiment of Russian soldiers sent to the Western Front as a goodwill gesture by the ailing Tarsis regime before it was overthrown. These soldiers had endured even worse conditions and even more incompetent leadership than their French and British allies. They were all too ready to follow their rebellious French comrades in mutiny. Their fate was pitiful. The French authorities had to with their own soldiers with some leniency. There were too many to punish, and harsh discipline might have provoked worse rebellions. And even in revolution, though were expandable, the regiment was surrounded and blown to pieces by the French artillery. Mutiny. The mutiny had lasted for 6 weeks. The French army had escaped a crushing defeat by the skin of its teeth. But the soldiers who had rebelled had sent a clear message to their generals from now on that there would be no more mass attacks. French soldiers would only take part in small-scale assaults on the German lines, and so the horrific bloodletting of the previous 3 years came to an end. For the rest of the war, the lion's share of the fighting against the Central Powers would be left to Britain and the Commonwealth. And fresh and enthusiastic American troops who had entered the war just in time to save the Allies from the almost certain defeat. Behind the front lines, the government reacted by tightening conservatorship in the French newspapers and imprisoning those who had campaigned for an end to the war. These days, such people would be called peace campaigners. In 1917, they were called anti-war agitators. Even now, the mutiny is still a shameful and touchy subject in France. On its 80th anniversary in 1997, the French Prime Minister, Lionel Jospin, suggested the mutineers needed to be understood and forgiven. This provoked a stern denunciation from the French President Jacques Chirac. The act of expressing sympathy for those war-weary men was still considered an outrage. But nowadays, most people would agree that mutineers deserve pity rather than condemnation. They were, said French politician François Hollande recently, simply men who just got lost in a hell of fire and blood. The end of part 7, I think.